The wind was cruel that morning, sharp enough to slip through wool coats and sting the skin. It swept across Greenwood Cemetery, rattling the golden brown leaves that clung stubbornly to the oak branches, scattering the rest across the muddy ground. Beneath that gray, heavy sky, a polished mahogany coffin descended slowly into the earth. The ropes creaked under its weight, their sound oddly loud in the hush that had fallen over the mourners. David Reynolds stood at the edge of the grave, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his black overcoat. The fabric was tailored to perfection, just like every other suit he'd worn in his decades of business, but today it felt heavy, suffocating. For years, his name had been synonymous with steel and glass, with towers that cut into skylines and deals that broke records. He had been called ruthless, brilliant, unstoppable. None of it mattered now. Not here. Not with the hollow ache in his chest where Evelyn had lived. She had been more than his wife. She had been the anchor that steadied him when the weight of his own ambition threatened to pull him under. Evelyn had been warm where he was cold, patient where he was sharp, and she had never cared for the glitter of the world he'd built. She loved wildflowers more than diamonds, handwritten notes more than boardroom victories. Her absence now was a wound he didn't know how to close. They had never had children, though they had tried, and the emptiness that had once been just a quiet ache had become a cavern around him. People shifted, clearing their throats, murmuring condolences. He knew many were here out of loyalty or habit rather than love. There were faces from his business empire, politicians he'd shaken hands with, socialites who never missed a public event. Their black coats were expensive, their shoes polished, their grief rehearsed. Every handshake felt like an intrusion, every pat on the shoulder, an empty ritual. David's gaze drifted, searching for somewhere to rest that wasn't the coffin or the well-meaning masks of the wealthy. That was when he saw her. She stood apart from the crowd, near the sprawling trunk of an old oak tree whose roots rose and dipped in the damp earth. She couldn't have been more than 22, maybe 23. Her long brown hair fell loosely around her face, strands catching in the wind. She wore a simple jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed boots clothing out of place among the couture coats and silk scarves. Her hands were clenched into fists, her stance rigid, as though holding herself still required effort. Something about her was off, not wrong, but out of sync with the scene, like a single note in a chord that didn't belong. Her eyes, he couldn't tell from this distance if they were brown or green, were fixed on him. Not in the curious, assessing way strangers sometimes looked at him, but in a way that felt personal, knowing. The minister's voice faded. People began to drift away, the crowd thinning until only a few lingered. David stayed rooted in place, staring down at the dark soil covering Evelyn's coffin, wishing the earth could bury his loneliness along with her. A whisper of movement brushed at the edge of his awareness. Before he could turn, a light touch landed on his sleeve. He looked up, startled, and found himself face to face with the girl from the oak tree. Up close, she seemed even younger. There was a pallor to her skin, a tension in her jaw, and a glint in her eyes that made his breath hitch without knowing why. She leaned closer, not enough for anyone else to hear, and her lips parted. 3 words slipped into the cold air between them, soft, certain. Before he could speak, she stepped back, turned, and walked away through the swirling leaves without looking back. David stood frozen, the weight of her touch still burning faintly through the sleeve of his coat. The words she had spoken lodged in his mind, strange and insistent, like a thread tugging at something buried deep in his past. And he had no idea why they felt like the beginning of everything. The night pressed against the glass walls of David Reynolds' penthouse, the city glittering far below like a field of cold stars. He sat alone in his study, a half-empty glass of whiskey at his elbow, staring at nothing and seeing everything. Evelyn's face lingered in his mind, not the still, pale version from the funeral, but the way she looked in the early mornings, hair in soft disarray, the faintest smile tugging at her lips before she opened her eyes. The service had ended hours ago, yet he could still hear the murmur of voices, the crunch of shoes on frozen ground, and above it all, the other sound, 3 quiet words spoken by a stranger. The girl's face had been as vivid in his memory as Evelyn's. That touch on his arm had been light, almost tentative, but her gaze had been anything but. She had looked at him like she knew him, not as David Reynolds, billionaire and power broker, but as a man. And that was what unnerved him most, how quickly and completely she had pierced the armor he'd worn for decades. He had told himself at the cemetery that she was probably nothing a mourner who had mistaken him for someone else, a distant relative of Evelyn's who had lacked the courage to introduce herself. But the more he tried to dismiss her, the more her presence grew inside him. Like a splinter he couldn't reach down by midnight. The city had quieted into that rare hour when even New York seemed to exhale. He turned off the desk lamp, stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, and let the lights blur. Somewhere out there, she was walking home, maybe sleeping, maybe thinking of him the way he was thinking of her. And the words, God, the words, they refused to fade. They had not been said. Like a casual condolence, they had been delivered with intention, as if she'd been carrying them for a long time, waiting for the exact moment to speak them. The next morning, he was a man possessed. He moved through his usual routine: black coffee, treadmill, brief scan of the markets, but his mind was elsewhere. He barely registered the calls waiting for him, the meetings on his calendar. At 11, he dialed his driver. Joe, he said, his voice low, I need you to find someone. Joe was an old friend in all but name, a man who had been with him since his earliest deals, when David still drove himself around in a dented sedan. The girl from the funeral, Joe asked without hesitation. David's pulse quickened. You saw her. Hard to miss, Joe said, standing under that oak like she didn't belong there, but couldn't leave either. I need to know who she is, David said. Everything you can find. Start with the cemetery, check the guest logs, talk to the grounds crew. Quietly, Joe hesitated. She looked troubled. Sir, you sure this is a good idea? David's gaze drifted to the skyline, the morning light breaking over the rooftops. I'm not sure of anything. That's why I need to know. By late afternoon, Joe called back. I've got a name. Lena Brooks, 24, lives in Queens, works in a diner. And, sir, there's something else. David's stomach tightened. Go on. Her mother's name was Sarah Brooks. The air in the room shifted, heavy, electric. That name, that impossible, inescapable name. He hadn't heard it in over 2 decades, yet it hit him now with the force of a punch. Sarah Brooks, his first love. The woman who had taught him what it was to want something more than money. The woman he had left behind for an offer in New York that would shape his empire. Her mother. David said slowly. She's dead, Joe said quietly. Cancer. Last year. David's hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles ached. His mind was racing now, throwing open doors he had locked years ago. The timing, the age, the possibility. That nod at him with savage certainty. Joe, he said after a long moment. If she's 24, I know, Joe said. It's possible. The words hung there between them, unspoken, but understood. If Lena was Sarah's daughter, she could be his daughter too. David ended the call and sat very still in the silence of his penthouse. Outside, the city moved on without him. Inside, his world had shifted on its axis. The grief that had been his only companion these past days was now joined by something else: urgency, sharp and alive. Those 3 words were no longer a riddle to be set aside. They were a key, and he was going to find out exactly what they unlocked. The day after Joe's revelation, David sat at his desk on the 54th floor of Reynolds Tower, the city sprawling beneath him like a map he no longer recognized. Stacks of reports lay unopened. His phone buzzed with calls from investors, partners, and politicians who were used to having his attention within seconds. Today, he ignored them all. The name Sarah Brooks hadn't just resurfaced, it had detonated inside him. He could see her as clearly as if she were standing in the room now. Her quick smile, her hair catching the light as she tilted her head to listen, the way she used to call him dreamer when he spoke about skyscrapers and empires. He had been 23 when they met in Chicago. He had nothing but ambition back then, and she loved him for who he was, not what he could buy. But when opportunity came, a job in New York that would launch him into a different stratosphere, he had chosen it over her. He told himself she'd move on, that they'd both find lives that fit us better. What he hadn't known was that she might have been carrying his child. By noon, he couldn't sit still any longer. He called Joe. Where does she work? Small place in Queens, corner diner. I checked, she's on shift today. Take me there, David said. The ride out of Manhattan was suffocating. The black town car crawled through traffic, and each red light felt like a personal affront. As they crossed into Queens, the skyline behind him shrank. replaced by brick apartment buildings and narrow streets that seemed untouched by the city's relentless pace. Joe pulled up across from a squat diner with a flickering neon sign. Through the front window, David saw her, Lena. She moved quickly between tables, pouring coffee, taking orders, smiling politely at customers. It was a tired smile, the kind that belonged to someone who had learned to push through exhaustion. Up close, she was a mirror fracture between the people. He knew Sarah's delicate features, but with an intensity in her eyes that reminded him of himself. He almost turned away. After all, what right did he have to walk into her life after 24 years? But then she laughed at something a customer said, and the sound rooted him to the sidewalk. It was Sarah's laugh, pulled from another lifetime. David opened the door. A small bell jingled, and the warm scent of coffee and frying bacon washed over him. Conversation dimmed slightly. He knew how he looked: black suit, polished shoes. An outsider in a place like this. Lena was refilling a mug at the counter when she noticed him. Her smile faltered. For a moment, she just stared, the coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. Then, in a voice that carried more steel than surprise, she said, "Mr. Reynolds." The air between them tightened. "I was hoping we could talk," David said quietly. She set the pot down, wiped her hands on her apron, and met his gaze without flinching. "About what?" "Somewhere private," he suggested. Glancing around the diner, she studied him for a moment that felt far longer than it was, then nodded once. "I get off in an hour. If you're still here by then, we can talk." He took a booth by the window. An hour felt like a lifetime. He pretended to read the menu, sipped at coffee that tasted like ash, and watched her work. She never looked his way, but he could feel her awareness of him in the way she moved, as if careful not to give away anything. When her shift finally ended, she emerged from the back with a worn jacket and a messenger bag slung over her shoulder. "There's a park a few blocks from here," she said. "We can walk." They walked in silence, the cool wind threading between them. When they reached a bench beneath bare-limbed trees, she stopped. "I know who you are," she said, arms crossed. "I've known for a while." David's pulse thudded in his ears. "Did your mother ever tell you?" "Not directly, but when she got sick, I went through her papers. Your name was on my birth certificate." Her voice wavered, but her eyes didn't. "She never told you, did she?" He shook his head. "No. If I'd known, you didn't." She cut in sharply. "That's the point. My mom raised me alone. She worked herself to the bone just to keep food on the table. And you were out there building your empire." Her words struck like blows he couldn't dodge. "I can't change what I didn't know," David said, his voice low. "But I want to know you, if you'll let me." Lena stared at him for a long moment, then looked away toward the rustling leaves. "I don't know if I want to know you," she said finally, "but I'll think about it." It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either, and for a man who had built skyscrapers from nothing, that sliver of possibility felt like the tallest foundation he'd ever stood on. The days after their conversation in the park felt heavier than the weeks of grief that had followed Evelyn's death. David was a man used to control of his business, his image, his future, but now he was navigating something that refused to be bent to his will. Lena hadn't called, she hadn't written, and he was forcing himself not to send messages that might push her further away. Instead, he filled the silence by digging into her world, not to stalk her, not to corner her, but to understand her life in a way he had never been able to with Sarah. Every morning, he read through Joe's discreet reports, the hours she worked at the diner, the evening shift she sometimes picked up at the community art studio in Bushwick, the night she came home late with paint smudge on her sleeves. The word art had caught his attention first. Sarah had loved to draw in the quiet hours after dinner, sketching everything from crumbling brick buildings to strangers she spotted on the street. It was how she said she kept her heart alive when work and life tried to grind it down. If Lena had inherited that, then maybe, just maybe, there was more of Sarah alive in the world than he thought. On the fourth day, David made a decision. He would go to the studio, not to approach her, but to see for himself. The building was a converted warehouse, its brickwork weathered, graffiti climbing the walls in layered colors. Through the tall front windows, he saw movement artists bent over canvases, their brushstrokes quick and certain. He stepped inside quietly. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and coffee, and then he saw her. Lena was in the far corner, her hair pulled back, a brush in hand. She wasn't just painting, she was lost in it, her body leaning in, her strokes deliberate and fluid. He couldn't see the canvas yet, but he could see her intensity. It reminded him of watching Sarah on those nights she wouldn't even notice. He'd walked into the room, too absorbed in the lines forming beneath her pencil. When Lena finally stepped back, David caught sight of the painting. His breath caught. It was a woman's soft brown hair curling at the edges, eyes warm, a slight smile playing on her lips. Sarah, not just a likeness, but something deeper, as though Lena had managed to pull her mother's spirit out of memory and anchor it in color. He didn't notice the young woman standing beside him until she spoke. "You know her." David turned, startled. The woman had a nose ring and paint flecks on her hands. "Yes," he said after a beat. "A long time ago." She studied him, then glanced toward Lena. "That's her mom. She doesn't usually let people see that painting. You must be important." Important. The word felt heavy, undeserved. He thanked her quietly and slipped out before Lena noticed him. That night, back in his penthouse, he poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. Instead, he pulled out an old box from the back of his closet. Inside were pieces of a life he tried not to revisit. Photographs of him and Sarah, her handwriting, on scraps of paper, a pressed wildflower she had once tucked into his jacket pocket. He laid them out on the desk, staring at the fragments of a love he had chosen to leave behind. The next day, his phone rang. An unknown number. "It's Lena," came the voice, cautious but steady. David sat forward. "I'm glad you called. I've been thinking," she said. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel about all this, but I do have questions. Ask me anything." David said. There was a pause, then, "Did you love my mother?" He closed his eyes briefly. "Yes, I did." "Then why weren't you there?" She pressed. "I didn't know," he said, the words feeling too small for the truth. "If I had, but you didn't," she finished, her tone hard but not cruel, "and that's what matters." He took a breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me for something I didn't even know I needed forgiveness for, but I do want to know you, Lena. Whatever pace you're willing to let me." Another pause, then, softer. "There's a gallery night at the studio next week. Local artists, if you want to come, you can." David felt something in his chest loosen. "I'll be there." When she hung up, he stayed seated for a long while, staring out at the city. This wasn't a business deal he could close with charm or money. This was the slow, painstaking work of earning trust stroke by stroke, like the way Lena painted her mother's face. And he realized with a start that for the first time in decades, he didn't care how long it took. The night of the gallery event arrived with a low mist curling over the streets, softening the hard edges of Brooklyn. David's driver pulled up outside the converted warehouse in Bushwick, its brick walls splashed with murals that seemed to breathe in the glow of the street lamps. The windows were lit from within, shapes moving inside like silhouettes in an aquarium. For a man who had commanded the attention of senators, CEOs, and global investors, David found himself strangely uneasy at the thought of stepping inside. This was Lena's world, not his. Here, wealth and power didn't buy influence, art did. And he was entering not as a patron, but as a stranger with something to prove. The moment he walked in, the air shifted. The scent of oil paint and varnish was undercut by the sweetness of cheap wine. Laughter and the hum of conversation filled the room. The walls were crowded with canvases, some jagged and violent, others so delicate they looked like they'd dissolve if you touched them. He spotted Lena near the back, talking to a woman with hair the color of wet copper. She wore jeans spattered with paint and a faded sweater, her hair in a loose braid. There was no makeup to soften her sharp cheekbones. No jewelry except for the silver bracelet he had given her. She noticed him, and for a second, her face was unreadable. Then she gave a small nod acknowledgement without welcome and turned back to her conversation. It was more than he dared to expect. David moved through the crowd slowly, taking in the work on the walls. The paintings were raw and unfiltered landscapes fractured into shards. Portraits that seemed to watch you, abstract shapes vibrating with emotion. This wasn't the art that hung in corporate lobbies or penthouses. This was art born of struggle. Art that demanded you stop and feel something. When he reached the far corner of the room, he saw it. Lena's painting. It wasn't the one he had glimpsed before, the careful, almost reverent image of Sarah. This one was different. It was Sarah, again, but softer, her eyes lit with something unspoken, her hair slightly windswept. The background wasn't blank, but washed in warm, golden light. As though she were standing in the last rays of the sun. It pulled him in. He had buried Sarah in his memory as she'd been the last time. He saw her hurt, angry, and walking away from him on a cold Chicago street. This painting gave him a piece of her he had thought was lost forever. "You like it?" The voice was Lena's. She had stepped beside him without him noticing, her arms folded loosely. "It's beautiful," David said, and for once the words didn't feel like a transaction. "She never got to have a show of her own," Lena said. Quietly, her gaze fixed on the painting. She was always working, always tired. But she said one day she'd fill a wall like this. David swallowed hard. "She would be proud of you." Lena's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he thought he had said the wrong thing, but then she exhaled slowly, as if letting go of some unseen weight. "Maybe." A burst of laughter from across the room broke the moment. Someone called Lena's name, and she glanced over her shoulder. "I'll be back," she said, then walked away, her braid swinging against her back. David stayed where he was, studying the painting again. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see the copper-haired woman who had been speaking with Lena earlier. "You're David," she said, matter-of-factly. He hesitated. "And you are Olivia, friend, also the one who convinced her to show this piece tonight." Olivia's gaze was steady. "You being here, that's complicated for her, I figured," David replied. "She's not used to people staying," Olivia continued. "You want my advice? Don't make this about you trying to feel better. She'll smell that a mile away. Make it about her, or don't bother." Her words hit with the clean precision of a chisel against stone. He nodded once, more in acknowledgement than agreement. When Lena returned, she didn't come straight to him. She wove through the room, speaking to others, refilling wine glasses, laughing in that quick, surprised way that made something deep in his chest ache. But every so often, her eyes found his, just for a second. By the end of the night, when the crowd had thinned and the air smelled faintly of cooling paint, Lena walked him to the door. "You didn't embarrass me," she said, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "I'll take that as a win," David replied. She hesitated, her fingers tightening briefly on the doorframe. "Thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me." She gave a small shrug, as if it wasn't a big deal, and turned back into the studio. David stood outside for a moment, the mist curling around him, watching her disappear into her world. He had come tonight thinking he might somehow earn her trust. But what he'd learned was more important. Trust wasn't given all at once. It was painted in layers, built in moments, until one day the image became clear, and tonight had been the first stroke. 2 weeks passed after the gallery night, and David found himself replaying small moments from that evening with a clarity that surprised him. The way Lena's fingers had lingered on the bracelet as she spoke to someone else, the flicker in our expression when she talked about Sarah's dream, the fact that, despite her walls, she hadn't turned him away at the door for years. David's life had been a series of calculated moves, every conversation a negotiation, every decision weighed against its potential return. But this was different. This wasn't a deal to be closed. It was a bridge to be built, brick by patient brick. And he was beginning to understand that if he moved too quickly, it would collapse under him. Still, he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. The more Lena revealed in passing, the more David realized how little he knew about the years after he had left. He had never once looked back telling himself it was for the best, that they both needed space to grow, but now he imagined Sarah struggling to raise a child alone, her own ambitions buried under rent payments and double shifts. The thought twisted inside him like a knife. One cold Tuesday evening, he called Lena. To his surprise, she answered on the second ring. "Hi," she said cautiously. "I was wondering," he began, "if you'd have dinner with me this week. Somewhere quiet. No expectations, just time to talk." There was a long pause on the line, and for a moment he thought she'd refuse. But then she said, "There's a small Italian place near my apartment. Tomorrow night, 7. When David arrived the next night, the place was nothing like the restaurants he usually frequented. No valet parking, no polished marble floors, just a warm amber glow from the windows and the smell of garlic and baked bread spilling onto the street. Inside, the tables were small and close together, the walls lined with framed black and white photos of the owner's family in Italy. Lena was already there, sitting in a corner booth, her hair loose around her shoulders. She wore a navy sweater and no makeup, yet she looked more like Sarah in that moment than she ever had before. "You're early," she said, a faint hint of amusement in her voice. "Force of habit," David replied, sliding into the seat across from her. They ordered simple dishes, pasta for her, grilled fish for him, and for a while they spoke of safe things. The gallery's next exhibit, a stubborn leak in her apartment, the weather, but gradually the conversation shifted. "Can I ask you something?" Lena said, her eyes fixed on the stem of her wine glass. "Anything. Why didn't you ever look for her for my mom?" The question hit harder than he expected, because I thought she wouldn't want me to. When I left Chicago, it wasn't on good terms. I told myself I was doing the right thing by staying away. She waited for you to call," Lena said quietly. "She told me once, not for long, but she did." David's throat tightened. "I didn't know." "No," Lena said, meeting his gaze. "You didn't." The rest of the dinner passed in fits and starts, moments of closeness interrupted by stretches of silence. But when they stepped outside into the crisp night air, she surprised him. "Do you want to see something?" she asked. Of course. She led him down several blocks to a quiet residential street, stopping in front of a gated courtyard. The building beyond was old, but well-kept, ivy crawling up its brick face. "This is where we lived most of my life," she said. "She used to sit out here on summer nights after work, drinking tea and sketching. I'd fall asleep to the sound of her pencil." David could almost see Sarah at a small table, Lena curled up beside her, the night air carrying the faint scent of the city in summer. He imagined himself there, too, in a life that might have been, and the ache of it nearly brought him to his knees. When he walked her back to her apartment, she lingered at the door. "Thanks for dinner," she said, and then, after a hesitation and for listening, that night, in his penthouse, David opened a drawer in his desk and took out a small black box. Inside was a silver bracelet, simple and unadorned, with a message engraved on the inside: "For the daughter I never knew but will always love." The next evening, he returned to her apartment unannounced, the box in hand. Lena opened the door, brows knitting in surprise. "You didn't tell me you were coming." "I wanted it to be a surprise," he said, handing her the box. She unwrapped it slowly, her eyes moving over the engraving. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she whispered, "It's beautiful. I wanted you to have something real," David said. "Something from me that isn't about money or guilt, just us." Lena's gaze lifted to his, her expression unreadable. "I don't know how to be someone's daughter," she said softly. "I don't know how to be your father," he admitted, "but we can figure it out together." For the first time, she smiled, not the polite, guarded smile she used in public, but something smaller, warmer, almost uncertain. And in that moment, David knew the walls between them had shifted, not fallen, but moved enough for him to step just a little closer. Spring came to New York in slow, stubborn steps, patches of warmth broken by cold rain. The trees along the avenues hesitant to bloom. By then, it had been nearly a year since David first saw Lena under the oak tree at Evelyn's funeral. In that time, their relationship had been built in cautious increments, like an intricate sculpture where each new piece was tested for balance before being fixed in place. The silver bracelet never left her wrist now. He noticed it when she waved to him across a crowded room at one of her gallery events, when she lifted a coffee cup during their Saturday mornings at the corner cafe, even when she was painting tiny smudges of cobalt or sienna, sometimes staining the delicate metal dot. In the months after he'd given it to her, Lena's art had flourished. She had been offered a solo show by a respected gallery downtown, and her community studio had more students than space. It was during one of their late-night talks at the studio, long after the others had gone home, that she first told him about her dream, a gallery of her own, with a section dedicated to teaching underprivileged kids for free. "It's what Mom always wanted," she'd said, the paint-streaked brush still in her hand. A space where no one felt like they didn't belong. The memory of Sarah in her own cramped apartment sketching at the kitchen table came to him in vivid detail, and that night, back in his penthouse, David decided he would help her make that dream real. But this time, it wouldn't be a gift she could mistake for a bribe. This time, it would be a partnership. 3 weeks later, he asked her to meet him at a small property in Bushwick, a long vacant storefront, with high ceilings, tall windows, and brick walls that still bore the faded ghosts of painted advertisements from half a century ago. "It's rough," he admitted, watching her step inside, "but it has potential." She turned slowly in the empty space, sunlight catching in her hair. It feels. She hesitated. Right. I thought maybe. He said carefully, we could make it yours. Together. Lena's gaze snapped to his. You mean my gallery, our gallery? David corrected gently. You run it. You decide the shows, the programs, everything. I'll cover the renovations. But only if you'll let me stand beside you when we open it. She studied him for a long moment, weighing not the offer itself, but the trust it implied. And then, slowly, she nodded. What followed was unlike anything David had ever experienced. This wasn't like breaking ground on a high-rise or negotiating $1 billion merger. This was intimate, messy, and strangely joyful. They argued over flooring. She wanted reclaimed wood. He preferred polished concrete. They compromised on a mix. They spent hours debating the lighting, the arrangement of walls, the size of the workshop space for kids. By autumn, the gallery, now named Bridges, was ready. On the night of the opening, the place thrummed with energy. Critics mingled with local artists, students pointed out their work to parents, and the hum of conversation was underpinned by the faint strains of a jazz trio in the corner. Lena moved through the crowd with ease, introducing David to people as a friend and partner, though once, in a quieter moment, she called him Dad without thinking. The word lodged in his chest like a precious stone. Later that night, when the crowd thinned, she took him by the hand and led him to a small corner of the gallery he hadn't noticed before. On the wall hung a large black and white photograph of Sarah, early 20s, hair loose, smiling as if she'd just told a secret. Beneath it, a plaque read, "The Sarah Brooks Workshop." David reached out and touched the edge of the frame. "She's here," he murmured. "She always will be." Lena said. The next morning, they visited Greenwood Cemetery together. The air was crisp, the leaves just beginning to turn. At Sarah's grave, Lena laid down fresh flowers and a single paintbrush wrapped in a ribbon. "Mom," she said softly, "this is David. You didn't tell him about me, but he's here now, and I think you'd like him." David knelt beside the stone, the damp earth seeping into the knees of his trousers. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for not being there, for not knowing. But I promise you I will be the father our daughter deserves." Lena's hand found his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Months passed, and life settled into a rhythm neither had expected. The gallery thrived, the workshop's waiting list grew, and they traveled together for the first time to Chicago to see the streets where he had met Sarah, and where Lena decided to open a second workshop. And then, one quiet evening on the rooftop of her loft, as the city stretched out in golden light, Lena looked at him and said, "Do you remember the funeral? When I touched your arm?" David nodded. "I've thought about it every day since." She smiled faintly. "Do you want to know what I said?" "Yes." Her eyes met his, steady and certain. "Don't leave again." The words landed with a weight he couldn't describe, both a plea and a promise. And in that moment, under the fading light of the skyline he had once built his empire upon, David knew he never would. Because for all the towers and fortunes he had amassed, Lena was the only thing he had ever built that truly mattered.